everyone, and welcome to our fairy tale reading for today. As you guys probably already know by now, my name is Miss Kinsey, and I'm a librarian here at the Dell Rapids Carnegie Public Library. And today, our story is the original story of the Little Mermaid. Now, I have to be honest with you. I printed out the original version of the story. It was pages and pages long. Lots of description, lots of wonderful words. Oh, you guys, it was too much. It was just too much. 11 pages of this teeny tiny little print, and we didn't really need all of that detail. Hans Christian Andersen was an amazing storyteller, and he really, really did his best to put you into the story. So instead of reading that one, which would have taken us a really long time, I am going to read to you from the illustrated version from Usborne, the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. When I read both of them, this version has all the important things that the original version had. It just takes out some of that extra description, those extra words that we don't really need them. They're wonderful, they're lovely, but this gives us the entire story and just a little bit more condensed version, okay? So we are gonna read the original story of the Little Mermaid, just a little condensed, right? Now, I'm hopeful that you guys can see the similarities between the Disney version of The Little Mermaid and that story that we know, but that you'll also pick out the differences too. So here we go. Deep beneath the ocean lay an extraordinary palace. Its walls were made of delicate coral. The roof was adorned with pretty shells, and jewel-bright fish darted in and out of its open windows. The palace belonged to the King of the Sea, who lived there with his 6 daughters. The princesses were all very beautiful, with long wavy hair and shimmering tails. But the youngest was the most beautiful of all. Her eyes were bluer than the ocean itself, and her skin was whiter than pearls. Yet it was the youngest princess's voice that really made her stand out from the others. When she sang, it was as though 1,000 silvery bells were echoing throughout the ocean. The princesses led a happy and carefree life. The sea creatures were their playmates. All day long, they played hide and seek together among the coral. They took rides on turtles' backs, danced with the octopuses, and laughed at the clownfish's funny antics. But most of all, they loved to hear about the world beyond the waves. The princesses would listen spellbound as their grandmother told stories of mermaids without tails, flying fish that could sing, and starfish that twinkled in the night sky. Her granddaughters had never seen people or birds or stars, so this was how she described them so that they could understand. The princesses couldn't wait to see it all. When you turn 15, you shall, promised their grandmother. Oh, that seems like forever, sighed the youngest princess, who had the longest to wait. While her sisters played, she would often wander in the palace garden, dreaming about the world above. She sniffed the flowers and tried to imagine the sweet scent of the flowers on land. The other princesses had made flower beds in the shapes of sea creatures, but hers was a round like the sun. In the middle was a marble statue of a young man that she had found on the seabed. She would sit and gaze at it for hours on end. Eventually, the eldest princess's 15th birthday arrived. "Don't worry," she told her sisters as they waved goodbye. I'll come back soon and tell you all about it." The princesses waited impatiently for her to return. At one point, they heard a splash and dashed outside, but it was just a turtle. When at last she came back, they crowded around. "What did you see?" they asked eagerly. "I lay on a beach in the moonlight and watched the twinkling lights of the town," she said dreamily. "The church bells chimed across the bay, so much brighter and clearer than the muffled sounds of the ocean." The little mermaid closed her eyes and tried to imagine the bells ringing. She longed to hear them for herself. It was a whole year before it was the second sister's turn to visit the world above. She emerged as the sun was setting, just in time to witness a flock of swans flying across the red gold sky. "I've never seen such majestic creatures," she told her sisters. "They were so strong and yet so graceful." The third sister's birthday was in wintertime, and when she reached the surface, she had to break through the sea ice. Icebergs towered above her, sparkling like diamonds as the sun shone through them. The fourth sister was the boldest, so when her time came, she decided to explore further inland. She swam up a river and between some green hills until she reached a pretty lake where some children were splashing around. At first, she thought they were mermaids too. Then she noticed they had no tails and realized they must be people. She swam towards them, but a great hairy creature ran at her, making a terrible noise. It was only a dog, but the princess had never seen or heard one before, so she turned tail and fled. Her sisters listened to her story with awe. The world above the ocean sounded like a wonderful, terrifying place. After hearing about this adventure, the fifth sister wasn't taking any chances. She stayed out on the open sea, where she saw whales spouting fountains of water and dolphins leaping into the air. "I'm sure it's just as beautiful as the land, and much safer," she declared when she returned. Her older sisters nodded. Now that they'd seen the world for themselves, they were quite content to stay at home in the Sea Kingdom. But the youngest princess was still desperate to explore the world above. Every night, she stared out her window at the dark blue water and tried to picture the moon shining in the starry sky. At long last, the little mermaid's turn came. She rose through the water like a bubble, up and up and up. Bursting onto the surface, she took a deep breath. The fresh, salty air made her tongue tingle. As she looked up, she gasped. Looming above her was a huge ship with tall masts. Strings of lanterns swung as it dipped on the water, and lively music drifted down on the breeze. The little mermaid bobbed eagerly on the waves, trying to see what was happening. Up on the deck, there were people dancing. Ladies in bright silk ball gowns whirled around, accompanied by gentlemen in tall hats and fancy waistcoats. Then a trumpet sounded, and a handsome young man appeared. Everyone turned towards him. The gentlemen bowed, and the ladies curtsied, for the young man was a prince, and today was his birthday. The little mermaid was so enthralled that she didn't notice the weather start to change. Waves chased across the ocean, and seagulls circled the masts, shrieking a warning, but no one listened. Then the sky darkened, and large drops of rain began to fall. The wind struck up, and the guests hurried for cover, but the prince stayed to help the crew. sailors ran to and fro, unfurling the ship's sails, which flapped in the wind like startled birds. The sea grew wild and angry. Waves crashed across the deck and tossed the ship from side to side. Thunder rolled and lightning bolts ripped through the sky. With a mighty crack, the mast snapped in two and smashed down onto the deck. The ship gave a mournful groan and slowly keeled over. The little mermaid saw the prince plunge into the sea. For a moment, her heart leaped at the thought that he would be with her. But then she remembered what her grandmother had once told her. People couldn't live underwater. Quickly, she swam toward the prince through the splintered wreckage. But before she could reach him, he sank beneath the waves. With a flick of her tail, the little mermaid dived after him. She held tightly onto him and swam to the surface. The prince's eyes were closed, but he was still breathing. Close up, he looked just like the statue in her garden at home, and the little mermaid fell in love with him. All night long, she held the prince in her arms. Carefully, she kept his head above the water and let the restless waves carry them along. By the time the sun's rays crept across the sky in the morning, she was exhausted. But at last, the sea was calm. The waves had carried them into a sheltered cove lined with palm trees. The little mermaid lay the prince in the warm sand. Pushing his wet hair out of his eyes, she kissed him gently on the forehead. Just then, a noise disturbed her. Slipping back into the sea, she hid behind a rocky outcrop. A pretty young girl appeared and hurried over to the prince. He opened his eyes and smiled at her gratefully, for he did not know that it was the little mermaid who had rescued him. The girl smiled back and took hold of his hand. The little mermaid couldn't bear to watch any more. With a final, sorrowful glance, she dived beneath the waves. Her sisters were waiting for her at the palace, eager to hear about what she had seen, but she refused to tell them anything. As the weeks went by, she became more and more melancholy. Her hair grew tangled, and her eyes lost their sparkle. Every day, she would sit by the statue in the garden and think about the prince, while the garden she had tended so lovingly turned into a wilderness. Eventually, her grandmother took her aside. "What's wrong, my dear?" she asked gently. "You were so much looking forward to seeing the world, and yet, since you returned, you've been desperately sad." The little mermaid sighed and told her all about the prince. "Isn't there any way I can live on land so that I could be near him?" she asked. "It's not impossible," her grandmother began. Then she stopped and shook her head. "You must forget about it," she said. "Things are different there. Your lovely tail would seem ugly to him. People think you need to walk on clumsy legs to be beautiful. You wouldn't be happy." But the little mermaid couldn't forget. She'd heard her grandmother talk about a sea witch, and so she decided to ask for her help. The little mermaid felt sure the witch would know about such things, for she lived in a mangrove forest, which stood half in the sea and half on land. It was a long way, and the little mermaid didn't know how to get there, so she asked a pilot fish to be her guide. On the way, they passed the wreck of the prince's ship, and the little mermaid caught sight of the captain's skeleton. His bony fingers were still clutching the tiller. She shivered and swam quickly on. The pilot fish led her around swirling whirlpools. They threatened to suck them into the very depths of the ocean, where strange chimneys belch out clouds of black water, and fish have lights so that they can see one another in the dark. Eventually, they came to the sea witch's mangrove forest. The pilot fish waited at the edge, leaving the Little Mermaid to go on alone. As she dodged through the labyrinth of tangled roots, googly eyes peered out of the mud, and eerie jellyfish floated by. A sea snake glided up and coiled around her. "Come this way," it hissed. It led the Little Mermaid to the witch's cave. Taking a deep breath, she slipped inside. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. Her piercing green eyes seemed to stare straight into the Little Mermaid's heart. "I can prepare a potion that will enable you to walk on land, but it will hurt more than you can imagine." "I'm not afraid," said the Little Mermaid, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "You should be," said the sea witch. "Once you set foot on land, there's no going back. You can never return to your father's kingdom alive. If the prince falls in love with you, you will gain a human soul and live happily on land. But if he chooses to marry another, you will lose your life before the sun sets on their wedding day." The Little Mermaid turned pale, but she thought of the prince and nodded. "I'll do it," she said. "Very well," said the sea witch. She threw a handful of shark's teeth into her cauldron, added a few drops of blue blood from a squid, and squeezed in the breath of a pufferfish. Then she mixed it all together, chanting as she did. When the potion was ready, she poured it into a bottle. The Little Mermaid reached out to take it, but the witch snatched it away. "You haven't paid me yet," she snarled. "I don't have any money," said the princess. "Then give me the most valuable thing you own," said the witch. "Your voice." But how will I talk to the prince?" stammered the Little Mermaid. "That's no concern of mine," the witch snapped. "Do you want the potion or not?" The Little Mermaid hesitated. "Yes," she whispered eventually. It was the last word she ever spoke. She took the bottle and hurried back to the pilot fish. In silence, she swam up to the surface of the sea and to the shore where the prince's palace was perched high on top of a cliff. The Little Mermaid climbed onto the rocks and gazed up at the palace. Then she looked sorrowfully back out to sea. She blew a kiss to her family beneath the waves and swallowed the potion. She felt a searing pain as though a blazing sword had slashed through her tail, and when she looked down, it was no longer there. In its place was a pair of fragile legs which ended in 2 pretty white feet. Cautiously, the Little Mermaid tried to stand, but the pain was agonizing. Her legs gave way and she fell to the ground. "Let me help you," said a warm voice. She looked up to see the prince holding out his hand. Gratefully, she took it, and together they climbed the winding stone staircase that led to the castle. Every step was like walking on knife edges, but the Little Mermaid endured it bravely. "Where have you come from?" said the prince, for she was draped only in a cloak of seaweed. She tried to answer with her hands and her eyes, but the prince did not understand. When the Little Mermaid had rested, the prince's servants dressed her in flowing robes of rich blue silk embroidered with sparkling thread. "You're beautiful," said the prince when he saw her, and the Little Mermaid blushed. The two of them soon became close friends. The prince found her easy to talk to and told her his every secret. Of course, she never spoke a word in return, but her ocean blue eyes were full of understanding. One day, when they were walking in the palace gardens, the prince seemed distracted. "My father wants me to marry," he explained. "He has chosen a bride, and our wedding is tomorrow." A tear rolled down the Little Mermaid's cheek, The prince wiped it away. Don't cry for me with those wise eyes of yours. I'm sure I won't be forced to marry someone I don't love. He had no idea that the little mermaid was crying for herself. That evening, beneath a mournful moon, the prince told stories of shipwrecks and mermaids, and the little mermaid listened sadly. Suddenly, he turned to her. He lifted her face towards his and gazed at it fondly. I don't know why, but whenever I look at you, it reminds me of someone, he said. I was washed up on a beach and she rescued me. I only saw her once, but she captured my heart. The little mermaid cried out silently inside, for she could not tell him the truth, that it was she who had saved his life. In the morning, preparations for the prince's wedding party began. Bright banners were hung from the battlements, and chandeliers were dusted until they sparkled. The marble floors polished until they shone, while in the kitchens, a grand banquet was being prepared. By the afternoon, the palace was ready for the royal wedding. When the guests began to arrive, the band struck up a tune. Let's dance, said the prince, and he swept the little mermaid into his arms. As they floated across the floor, everyone was captivated by her graceful swaying movements. The little mermaid danced as though her life depended on it. Her dainty feet were cut to ribbons, but in spite of the pain, she wished the dance could last forever. But suddenly, the music stopped. A murmur went around the hall, and the prince's bride made her entrance. The prince stared in astonishment. It's her, he gasped, for the bride was the girl who had found him on the beach. From that moment on, the prince had eyes for no one else. He didn't notice the little mermaid creep away or the trail of footprints that led down to the sea. Down on the shore, the little mermaid was bathing her feet. It stung terribly, so she also found the coolness strangely soothing. She picked up a seashell and held it to her ear. For a moment, she thought she could hear her sisters calling to her. As the sun sank down toward the horizon, the church bells rang out to celebrate the prince's wedding. They were even louder and clearer than the little mermaid had imagined. At the final chime, she slipped softly into the sea and dissolved in the deep blue waves. The end. I don't know about you guys, but I like the Disney version better. That was a very sad tale, wasn't it? She turned herself human, made friends with the prince, but it wasn't quite enough, was it? How very sad. Well, I hope you guys all enjoyed this original reading of The Little Mermaid. We have one more story to tell next week, and I hope you guys can join me then. See ya!